The Montana wilderness in the depths of winter is brutal, where survival is governed by animal instinct, power, and raw will. Until one night, during a blizzard that lashed the mountains, it all changed. Miles away from shelter, a father and daughter were not the only ones caught in the storm. From the shadows of the pines came a small figure, silent, desperate, and impossibly stubborn. A tiny bobcat cub with just a little fight left in it crawled behind them in the snow, step by shaking step. How had this untamed beast come begging for their aid? And would they be able to save it before the storm took them all? What follows is the amazing tale of survival, trust, and a trip that transformed their lives permanently. So before we begin, please start the video by liking it, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that bell so you won't miss any new stories. When the January wind howled through the pine trees of the Montana wilderness, it brought with it a flurry of snow that dimmed visibility to only a few feet. Mark Townsend pulled a wool cap low over his ears and adjusted the scarf that hid most of his face. At 53, he was familiar with the harsh winters of the Northern Rockies, having lived most of his adult life in this isolated nugget of the Bitterroot Range. His daughter, Emma, 12, followed him, walking in as bright a blue snowsuit as there was against the white backdrop. "How much farther, Dad?" Emma's voice was lost to the wind. "Just another mile to the ridge," Mark assured her, peering at his compass. "I promise the view will be worth it." Emma had been anticipating this winter hike for weeks. Ever since her mother died 3 years ago, these father-daughter escapades had been their special ritual, helping them feel connected not only to each other, but to the outdoors that had meant so much to Susan. The forecast had called for clear skies, but mountain weather is notoriously fickle. The snowstorm came on suddenly about a third of the way into the hike, turning an enjoyable experience into more of a chore. Mark wasn't concerned. They were well equipped, and if they turned back now, their cabin was just 6 miles away. "Perhaps we should go home," he suggested, seeing Emma's rising, red-cheeked complexion. "We will leave the ridge for another day." Emma nodded, disappointed, but not willing to argue the wisdom of her father's words. They retraced their steps, rerouting themselves from their in-progress path and following in their own half-filled tracks back toward the cabin. After walking for around 20 minutes, Mark saw something out of the ordinary. A small set of tracks, fresh in the snow, crossed in front of them. They were too small for an adult predator, but had the characteristic pattern of a feline. The round pads and lack of claw marks told him it wasn't a canine. "Dad, look!" Emma gestured toward a cluster of fir trees laden with snow. Mark glanced in her direction and saw movement. A tiny, tawny creature tripping through the deep snow. Its gait was wobbly, its head drooping. "It's a bobcat," said Mark, his voice low with astonishment. "A young one. Is it hurt?" Emma asked, her tone tinged with worry. Mark shook his head. "Not sure, but it's certainly struggling and likely separated from its mother during the storm." They watched as the bobcat cub lifted its head and released a wretched cry that traveled through the wintry air. It then turned and started moving towards them. "Hold still," Mark said to Emma. "Wild animals, even cubs, could be unpredictable." The cub lurches forward, tumbling constantly in the thick snow. Even its winter coat could not hide its protruding ribs, and its eyes were dull with fatigue. Mark judged it no more than 4 or 5 months old enough to have been weaned, far too young to survive on its own, and certainly not under these circumstances. "Dad, it's what we need to help," Emma whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "It's going to die out here." Mark knew she was right. If it was alone, as it was in this brutal storm, you could almost guarantee that the young bobcat would not survive without its mother. He was, however, always telling Emma that interfering with wildlife was never a good idea. Nature had her way, however cruel it sometimes felt. But when the cub stumbled again and settled in the snow, quaking and looking them in the eye with what looked like a plea for help, Mark felt a pull at his heart he couldn't evade. Susan would have done something, he thought, even with her respect for wild things. If there was anything you could do, you would never leave a creature to suffer. Fine, he said at last, but we need to be cautious. He took off his outer scarf, a heavy hand-knit one Susan made him years back. He called to the cub in a low, quiet voice, knowing that the animal couldn't understand him. But he did it to show the animal he was not a threat. "Hold up, Munchkin. We're going to take care of you." The bobcat cub didn't run away as Mark half feared. Instead, it stayed where it had dropped, too feeble even to scare. Tucking it in carefully, Mark then lifted the cub, wrapping the scarf around the small body. It was far lighter than it should have been, and he could feel the rapid, weak heartbeat through his hands. "Is it going to be okay?" "What happened?" Emma asked as her father came back with the bundle of fur. "I don't know, baby. It's looking pretty rough." He tucked the bundle into his jacket for extra warmth. "But we'll do what we can." The walk back to their cabin suddenly had added urgency. Mark was even more concerned when the bobcat cub didn't struggle against his grasp. Wild animals, and even cats, generally struggled against restraint with all their might. The compliance of this one spoke volumes to its desperate state. By the time the outline of their cabin loomed beyond the swirling snow, Mark's arms ached from toting the extra weight and maintaining his pace. Emma scrambled in first, unlocking the door and agreeing to stoke the fire, which had been banked in the wood stove since they left. In the warm cabin, Mark laid the bundle in a scarf on the kitchen table while Emma filled a hot water bottle. She and the young man made a nest for the little puppy in an old wooden crate, lining it with clean, soft blankets and putting it near the wood stove where the heat was greatest. "What does it need, Dad?" "But how do you know if it is sick?" Emma asked, her face on the floor, eyes glued to the barely moving fur ball. Mark thought long and hard about the question. He was not a wildlife rehabilitator, but he had been around the local wildlife centre enough to know the basics. First warmth. Then maybe some food and water, but don't put too much in too soon. He poured a little water into a small bowl, sprinkling in a pinch of salt and sugar, a basic rehydration mixture he'd learned about from one of the centre's volunteers. "And we have to be ready that it may not succeed, Emma. It's pretty far gone." Emma's expression hardened with resolve. "It will make it. I know it will." Mark didn't argue. Instead, he demonstrated how to offer small amounts of the rehydration solution to the weak cub with an eyedropper. At first, the bobcat would not swallow, but after several attempts, with the staff member remaining patient, it started to accept the liquid. And as darkness enveloped them and the storm raged on outside, Mark and Emma coded shifts keeping an eye on their uninvited guest. Mark tried making some calls on their satellite phone to the nearest wildlife rehabilitator, but it could reach no roads, for they were all closed from the storm. They had to fend for themselves, at least for the next few days. "What should we call it?" Emma said, sitting cross-legged on the floor next to the crate and gazing at the steady rise and fall of the cub's breathing. "Emma, let's not name it," Mark said. "Remember, it's not a pet. It can't live, if it survives, in the wild." Emma nodded but looked contemplative. "I know, Dad, but it must have a name while it is with us. How about Ash? Because its fur is sort of that colour, and we found it when it was near, gone, like ashes." Mark smiled despite himself. Ash it is then. They kept vigil through that long night. By morning, the cub was still alive, to Mark's surprise. Not just alive, but giving small indications of improvement. Its eyes appeared clearer, and it had begun making feeble efforts to groom itself, a positive sign in cats of all kinds. The coastal storm lasted 3 days, during which their small cabin transformed into a makeshift wildlife hospital. Mark rigged a feeding bottle out of supplies from their first aid kit, and they fed the cub small amounts of a combination of egg and milk and tiny bits of the venison jerky they had packed for their hike. By day 4, when the storm finally released its grip, Ash was strong enough to stand around and even explore the limits of what the crate would allow. His real self started to come through. Watchful, surprisingly sweet, but with glimpses of the feral spirit that was his destiny. "We need to get him to live. The wildlife centre will come as the roads clear," Mark said to Emma at breakfast. They will know how to rehabilitate him properly for release. Emma's face fell. Can't we have him just a bit longer? He's getting better with us. Mark sighed, knowing that she had taken a shine to the little bobcat, but that he had to do what was best for its future. Let me make another call. Surprised him, he said of the Wildlife Centre's director. They were maxed out because of the brutal winter and several rescues post-storm. On hearing Mark explain the cubs' state and what care they were providing, the director said they should keep doing what they were doing for a few more weeks, with the centre's staff advising them over the phone. Do they want us to keep him? Emma said, her eyes lighting up as Mark relayed the news. Just temporarily, Mark emphasized, until they find space or until he's strong enough to be released somewhere near where we found him. And we have to be careful we don't afford him to become too accustomed to us. He has to remember he is wild. Emma nodded, but looked far too excited. I'll be careful, Dad. I promise. The next few weeks were life-changing for all of them. Ash gained strength each day as his coat regained its luster and his movements became more coordinated and powerful. They transferred him from the crate to a larger enclosure that Mark constructed in a corner of their covered porch, enabling the bobcat to experience outdoor temperatures and smells while still sheltered from the elements. Taking the advice of the rehabilitation centre, they limited their direct contact with Ash, though Emma struggled not to sit near his enclosure, reading her books out loud, as if the wildcat really cared what happened in her stories. To Mark's comical delight, Ash would often appear to listen, his tufted ears pivoting toward the sound of her voice. Winter had turned toward spring, and Ash's behaviour shifted. He grew more restless, pacing his enclosure, showing more interest in the forest beyond their cabin. The time, Mark knew, was growing near to start the process of taking him back to the wild. We've got to start taking him out, Mark said to Emma one night in early March. Allow him to rediscover what it is to be a bobcat. Emma nodded, but her eyes told another story. How do we do that? Mark outlined a plan he had come up with, and the Wildlife Centre had provided input on it. They started introducing Ash out into the woods on a long lead to explore and develop instinct, but brought him back to the safety of the enclosure. Their initial outing was tentative. She said Ash appeared daunted by the sudden vastness of woods around him, sticking close to Emma's legs and jumping at every noise. But each outing after that was better and better. His instincts kicked in despite his odd upbringing, and he started stalking the little creatures. By the middle of April, they began to leave the lead off during these forest outings, letting Ash roam but still remaining at a distance with him. The bobcat would always come back to them when called, which was a source of both comfort and concern for Mark. A wild bobcat should not come when called like a domestic cat. He's in danger of getting too attached to us. That night, after Ash had come back to the cabin of his own volition, Mark confessed to Emma. The rehab centre says we have to enter the final phase of release. Emma choked on tears, but she nodded bravely. What do we do? We have to stop calling him. Allow him to stay out for longer with each time. He always ends up choosing the forest where he belongs. The process proved more difficult than either expected. Every time they left Ash in the forest, Emma would look back over her shoulder, her face a blend of hope and heartbreak. And each time, for several days, Ash would eventually show up at the edge of the clearing by their cabin, meowing to be let into his enclosure. It's not working, Dad, Emma said after nearly 2 weeks of this routine. He doesn't want to be wild? Mark sat by his daughter on the porch steps and watched as Ash preened himself one last time in the setting sun. This isn't what he wants, Emma. It's about what he needs. What's best for him long term? But why can't what's good for him include us? Her voice was small but unrelenting. Mark chose his words deliberately, mindful that this was a lesson larger than the bobcat. Because Ash was born wild. Honey, that wildness runs in his blood, in his bones. In this moment, he is young and the forest is a big, scary world compared to the safety of his pen and the meals we deliver regularly. But as he gets older, he'll be drawn to his true nature more and more. He draped his arm around her shoulders. If we deny him that, what he was meant to be, we would do him a great disservice. He would never be fully happy or fulfilled. We'd be hurting him for our sake, not his. Emma was silent for a long beat, studying Ash. They make mistakes, like how you always let me try things even though they're hard or scary. Because you know I have some sort of lesson to learn? Mark smiled. His heart swelled with pride at her insight. Exactly like that. The following day, they took Ash deeper into the woods than they had ever done before, to where the signs of small game abounded. When it was time to go home, they walked away without looking back or calling for him to follow. It was the toughest walk of Emma's young life. He could see her fighting against the impulse to look back, to see if Ash was behind and at a distance, as he so often was. But she remained focused ahead, her tiny hand gripping him for dear life. Ash didn't come back to the cabin that night, or the next. The third night, what he heard from Emma's bedroom was her muted sniffles. Mark knew she was crying herself to sleep. He was sitting on the edge of her bed, stroking her hair. "I miss him," she whispered. "I know, sweetheart. I do too. Is he going to be all right out there?" Mark considered this. "I think he's finding his way." "And how strong did he got? How well was he hunting when we knew he was hunting while we trained? He has all the right skills." A week went by without a word from Ash. Then one day, as Mark was chopping wood while Emma did her homeschool assignments inside, he observed something moving at the edge of the back forest. And there, resting peacefully in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the trees, was Ash. Something was different about the bobcat, muscular and alert, his coat camouflaged in the wood's shadows. His eyes, bright and intelligent, no longer contained the dependency of kittenhood as he peered at Mark. "Emma," Mark called softly toward the open window. Coming slowly out from here, Emma came on the porch where her face shifted from curiosity to happiness when she gathered Ash. He came back. "Do not go near him," Mark warned. "If he wants him, let him come to us." They huddled together, hardly breathing, while Ash pondered them from his perch at the edge of the forest. Then the bobcat crossed the clearing with slow steps. He halted a couple of feet away, looking at them with what seemed to be recognition, but also a new caution. Emma knelt slowly, hand extended palm down, just as they always did. Ash stood frozen for a long moment. Then he stepped closer and briefly pressed his head to her hand, stepping back afterward. He made the same gesture with Mark, a rumbling purr vibrating from his chest. "He remembers us," Emma said, tears rolling down her face. "Yes," Mark said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But he's bidding adieu, I believe." As if to validate his words, Ash turned and trotted back into the forest. On the edge, he paused, silhouetted in strong relief against the green, one last look back. Then, with a twitch of his tufted ears, he vanished into the thickets. Emma was leaning against her father. There was sadness and something else, something resembling pride on her face. "He is wild now, right?" "He always was," Mark said tenderly. "We simply helped him rediscover his path toward it." In the years that followed, they occasionally glimpsed a bobcat in the woods near their cabin. They could never really know it was Ash, but Emma liked to believe it was, a year later, fully grown and thriving in the wilds that were his true home. Mark had given Emma a carved wooden bobcat with the same fierce spirit they had seen in Ash when she turned 16. As she rotated the carving in her hands, he added, "To remind you that sometimes the greatest love we can show is in letting go." Emma put the carving on her windowsill. The morning light would hit it every day. I'm pretty sure Mom would have appreciated how we helped him. Mark smiled, remembering Susan and her unfettered love for all living creatures. "She would have been proud of you, Emma. Your compassion, your strength, and your wisdom and understanding in the moment to say goodbye." Outside, as twilight fell over the Montana wilderness, a bobcat's cry rang from the trees. It was wild and free and belonged there.